Funding for this program was provided by Friends of Iowa Public Television, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, and generations of families and friends who feel passionate about Iowa Public Television programs.
I tell you what, well-being is real. It's here to stay.
On January 7th, 2013, Brandon Busteed, education director at Gallup, talked about the alarming results of a Gallup student poll on just how engaged students remain as they progress in grades 5 through 12. He spoke before a business summit to drive education reform held in downtown Des Moines. This is Intelligent Talk Television.
Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Probably first thing I need to do is I need to thank Des Moines for your excellent insight in building this skywalk, because I neglected to come to Iowa without a coat on this trip. So if I hadn't been able to walk from my hotel to the convention center through the skywalk, I'd be in big trouble. In any event, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Gallup, as many of you know, it's a name obviously that has roots in Iowa. Dr. George Gallup is probably one of the more famous folks from Iowa, degrees from University of Iowa. And one thing that Gallup has been doing for the last 70 years is essentially trying to unearth the insights of what I would call human development. So what I want to talk to you about today is essentially the best of what we've learned about what we call the economics of human development. And when you listen to it, it kind of changes everything that we think about in education. So I want to start actually by asking a question of the audience, right? I want you to think, I've been thinking a lot about great teachers. And Gallup has been studying the best teachers for the last 4 decades now, and I want to talk to you about what we've learned from that. But I want to start by asking you all to think for a moment right now about the best teacher that you ever had. Say their name to yourself so that the name is in your head, right? Mine's Alma Blunt. So you've got that best teacher in your head. Now, we've asked Americans this question. We've said, think about your best teacher. And then we've asked the next question to say, now, what was it that they did that made them your best teacher? So I have the answer of what Americans tell us. There's one word that Americans use most when they describe what it is that their best teacher did. Anybody want to take cracks on it based on your own thinking about what your best teacher did for you? I've heard care. Care is it. Care, nailed it on the head. Relationships, inspire. I heard a few other things. But just pause for a moment and think about how simple and yet profound that is. They cared. They cared, right? Now, what else have we learned about the best teachers? They're people who have innate talents that include things like being very high in individualization. So a lot of folks today have been talking about the need for individualization. The best teachers in our country are people who try to get to know every single student in their classroom, what makes him or her tick. And then what do? They utilize that in the educational experience. They're also people who are high in what we call relational, right? So a couple of folks said something about relationships. They just instinctively want to build relationships with the students that are in their classrooms, with the parents or guardians of those students, right? So I just want you to pause on this. Care, individualization, relational, and start to think now about our current educational system, the incentives that we're putting in front of everybody, how it's operating. I would argue that we are neutralizing the best teachers because they have very little ability and time to go down the pathway of caring, providing individualization for each student, and building relationships. So we're going to talk about what we call edunomics, or the economics of how we get back to winning in education. So I'm going to start with the Cliff Notes version and just walk you through a couple points. This is not new, but we are in a period right now where you could argue it's the greatest upheaval in the history of education, mainly because there's been upheaval in how the world works, right? All the commenters today have talked about this, and I'll expand a little bit. We're disengaging students, and this was a finding that Gallup actually announced this morning that was covered in the Des Moines Register about students' engagement in school. by neutralizing the best teachers because we're fundamentally aiming at the wrong targets in education. And to make matters worse, we're trying to fix all this by using a deficit-based model. Okay, we wake up and we try to figure out what's wrong with schools, how ineffective teachers are, and what students don't know. That's our orientation to this, and I would argue that our problem is the problem, that we're looking at it as a problem, and if I talk to you about what Gallup knows about human development, we know one fundamental thing. No one ever became great focusing on their weaknesses. They found out what they were good at, what their strengths were, and they excelled at those. They put them to use every single day, not once a week, not once a month, every single day. So that's the Cliff Notes version of my whole speech. If you want to check out or leave early, you know everything that I'm going to say now. You can just, you can head off. So first of all, we've got all these forces, right, that are kind of collapsing on education. By the way, they're collapsing on business organizations as well, okay? This is the whole world that's being driven by this. But in particular, we have things that are around affordability and access, around information technology. It's changing so many things in our world. All of this is kind of hit with questions about value, questions about academic rigor. It goes on and on. I'm going to talk about this in a couple of basic ways. So the first one is that we've reached a turning point in America. So many of you saw this data earlier this year. It was the first year where more babies were born to traditional minority categories than Caucasian. So if you just carry this forward in 15 years, 18 years into our colleges and universities, the vast majority of students coming to college are going to be traditionally minority categorizations, right? So this just, I can't stress how much this changes everything. A lot of people critique our educational system because they say it really only works for Caucasian kids or students who come from high socioeconomic backgrounds. So think about what this, I mean, it's almost a tidal wave, a tsunami of demographic changes that we're going to be dealing with as it relates to this basic data. The other thing we know about, and we talk about this specifically in the college cost arena, and our colleague from Drake mentioned this earlier, but we are literally in a situation where we have completely unsustainable costs of college. If you look at the cost of college tuition in the last 18 years, it's gone up almost 250%. We complain a lot about healthcare costs in the United States, right? I mean, that's been a major topic of conversation. You could argue that our healthcare costs are going to bankrupt this country. The cost of higher education tuition has gone up 2x that of healthcare costs in the last 18 years. I did the math on this. I have a 3.5-year-old daughter, and I thought I was out of the gates. I went to a financial planner, and I said, hey, how much should I be saving for her college education, right? And so we did the math, and we figured that if this same increase, 248%, takes place over the next 18 years, I'll need $750,000 to send her to my alma mater. My alma mater is not cheap, so that they have a whole other issue. But the point is here, that is utterly unsustainable, right? The current trajectory is just unacceptable, unsustainable. For most Americans, it's not even going to be an option. In the midst of all this, we have a fascinating thing going on where I would argue the cost of knowledge is trending towards free. You can today take every single course offered by MIT online for free. You can't get a degree, but you can literally take every single course, all the content, all the quizzes, exams, etc., for free. You can do this through Khan Academy. You can do it through all the MOOCs. I don't know who coined this term MOOC, but massive open online course MOOC. It's already out of the gates, so I get to talk about MOOCs in speeches. But the idea here is that we're not going to compete on what we know. What we know is trending towards free. And at the same time, that the rate of knowledge is expanding exponentially, right? And we can see this in all kinds of data, how many articles are posted on the internet, et cetera. Literally, it's an exponential growth of knowledge. It's impossible for any of us to know everything we need to know in our job, right? So we're not going to compete on knowledge. And this is data, every time I share it, it still is stunning, right? There were a couple comments earlier about grade point average and how parents don't want to make trade-offs right now because, you know, here's where well, check this out. This is college grade point average from the early 1960s. At the same time that we look at the hours that students spend studying each week. Now, you don't have to be an educational rocket scientist to look at this and kind of scratch your head wondering what's going on here. So there's a couple fundamental things that we could probably draw as conclusions. this generation is way smarter than previous generations by almost a whole grade point average, doing half as much work to get there, right? I don't know if I buy that necessarily, but you can also look at this the way most of us look at this problem, which is we've had a period of rampant grade inflation driven by a consumerist mentality about schools. So the other comment was made about how we've looked at higher education as a public good to a private good. Well, guess what? Education right now, our biggest consumer of education is essentially parents. Parents who demand good grades for their kids so they can get on to the next stepping stone, not necessarily making them work the hardest, figuring out what they like to do, figuring out what they're best at. So we've got some real challenges here. And this was the data that Gallup released just this morning from our Gallup student poll, which surveyed close to 500,000 grade school students in grades 5 through 12. What we saw is probably something that's not surprising, but nonetheless incredibly depressing, which is the percentage of students who are engaged in school. 76% of elementary kids are engaged. That drops to 61% in middle school and 44% in high school. And interestingly enough, that 44% is about the percent that goes on to college, right? So these engagement numbers are really important numbers. You could argue that they're essentially the gold standard that everybody is shooting for. Student engagement is what we want to achieve. Now, that goes hand in hand with also seeing improvements in math and reading and all kinds of other things that we're measuring, but student engagement's a pretty fundamental one. It's no surprise, then, that the American public's confidence in public schools has been dropping every year since Gallup started measuring this in the 70s. So we're at an all-time low now of about 29% of Americans having confidence in public schools. By the way, that's far better than Congress. I think Congress is at, what, 18%, Joe? What, 12? Yeah, so we're doing 3 times better than Congress in our ratings. So we have a lot of good things to feel good about here in the midst of this process. But in all this, right, just take all this crazy upheaval, all these things that are going on, I think we've lost our way. Because what we need to do is take a step back, take a deep breath, and ask ourselves a very simple but profound question. What is the ultimate outcome of an education? So just try and answer that in your own words right now. What's the ultimate, I mean, go ahead, if anybody wants to volunteer a couple answers, what would you say is an ultimate or the ultimate outcome of an education? Prepared. Can you expand a little more? Prepared for? Prepared for whatever you're going to do. Okay. Yes. Lifelong learners. Yep. Learn to think. Application of the knowledge. So practical output of that. Give me a couple others. Get a job, make a living. Any job? Better than no job. Yep, absolutely. To get a job, make a living. Creativity, imagination. Sustain the economy. Think about all these answers, right? I mean, I just polled a crowd in Iowa. Think of all these answers, and we're going to come back to this because I want to know if we're actually measuring any of that. So here's where we are right now in measuring outcomes in education at a national level. And I wish this were a more complex slide, but it actually isn't. It's very simple. U.S. News and World Report rankings, for example, which do a very good job reporting on the data that schools make public. Okay, so this is not necessarily throwing U.S. News and World Report under the bus. But basically, a lot of the rankings criteria in U.S. News and World Report is based on inputs of the college students who are attending those college universities. Harvard is mainly the #1 ranked college and university in those rankings because they have the highest SAT scores of incoming freshmen. We're not evaluating Harvard on how well they did with those freshmen from freshman year to graduation. We're evaluating Harvard based on selectivity, SAT scores, GPA, rank in class of the freshmen that are coming to the institution, okay? On the other side, we have the outputs. These are our national measures that we use to quantify the output of education. They're real simple. GPA, or rank in class, and you guys have seen how effective that measure looks like it's been over the last 40 years. I don't even know what a 3.1 means anymore, right? I mean, it's really difficult. Someone comes to me with a 3.1, 3.2, I have no idea what that means. I don't know what a 3.2 means at Harvard versus a 3.2 at Princeton versus a 3.2 anywhere else in the country. We also have things like retention, right? Degree attainment, so on and so forth. So if you just think about it in real simple terms, it's grades, and graduation. That's what we're measuring. And if we look at those measures, we don't feel like we're doing a great job because we've got almost half of our college students not even graduating to begin with. And then of those who do get a degree, this is where it gets really interesting, almost 50% of them are either in a job that doesn't require a college degree or they're unemployed. Okay, so if the degree was the end-all be-all outcome measure, we wouldn't have that kind of counterpoint of 50% of those with degrees in jobs that don't require a degree, right? And you can still argue that they're better off than not having that degree, but it just kind of shows you where we're at here. So the other measure that we've introduced recently is this gainful employment measure, which is, did you get a job? Just any job. Doesn't matter what kind, doesn't matter if you liked it, so on and so forth, just did you get a job? So gainful employment measures as a success the law school graduate who gets a job as a barista at Starbucks. That's a fine job, but I don't think that you needed to go to law school in order to be a barista. But that's counted as a win in gainful employment data because it's any amount of employment, right? Any kind of employment in gainful employment. So think about that. Those are our national measures, but then I'll hit you with a zinger right now. Hope, I know I need to say it a few times because they're like, what? What is he saying? Hope is a much stronger predictor of college success than SAT or ACT scores or GPA. So we have this expression in our country, hope ain't a strategy, right? How many of you use that or use that often? Nix it. Hope is a strategy. Hope's a really important strategy when it comes to schools and student engagement. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So I just showed you the outcomes that we're using to measure in our country. And none of those get at any of the answers that this audience started to describe, preparing somebody for life and, some sort of productive outcome, et cetera. So I would argue we're aiming at the wrong targets, and that's where we need to begin in changing things. Now let me just give you a little data on standardized testing. I'm a fan of standardized testing only in as much as we understand where it should be placed in the context of this system. If we put 100% of our eggs in the basket of standardized testing, we're in really big trouble. And I'd argue that we're real close to that right now in terms of how we're evaluating teachers and students. It ought to be roughly a third, and I'll come back to that because there's actually some research around it. So I'm not saying, don't hear me say get rid of standardized testing. What I am saying is we need to lessen our extreme focus and reliance on standardized testing as a measure of success. So thank you. Here are countries that have overlapping data between PISA scores, which are international standardized testing scores in math and reading, and countries that also participate in the Global Entrepreneurship Measure, or GEM. So there's about 30-some countries where we have measures in both where you see an overlap. And the stunning finding from this was that there was a negative correlation between standardized testing scores and entrepreneurial activity in these countries. So, when you look at this, you see Singapore, for example, they're crushing it with standardized testing, #1 in the world. Gallup just reported last month that they're also the #1 country in the world where people who live there experience the fewest emotions. I don't know that we want to aim for that. Now, I can't jump to the conclusion that standardized testing has driven no emotion, but you understand where I'm going with this point. So when you look at this, you start to say, geez, something like entrepreneurship is such a critical engine of economic revival as it comes to thinking about how we boost our economy. The vast majority of all new jobs are created by new small and medium businesses, right? I mean, it's startling data, and so if we understand that, we think about our path to rebuilding our economy as finding entrepreneurs, putting them in places where there's a developmental pipeline for those entrepreneurs, and you can argue that our schools are neutralizing some of the best entrepreneurs. I mean, think of our titans of industry right now, right? Michael Dell, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Ellison. We can go on for a while. They all have something in common. They didn't make it all the way through our school system, at least not all the way through our higher ed system, right? So here's where we are, right? I made the point at the beginning that our problem is the problem. Our focus on this as a deficit-based model is what's killing us right now. So the field of psychology has spent its entire history, for the most part, trying to study what's wrong with people, right? I mean, that's pretty much what we've done in psychology. One of the things that Gallup has pioneered, Don Clifton, who is one of the luminaries that has worked for Gallup, is essentially considered the father of strength psychology. And he got real interested in trying to figure out what made successful people successful, or what made healthy people healthy, right? Instead of studying why sick people become sick, he kind of looked at the opposite end of this equation. And what we learned was what I mentioned earlier. All successful people didn't get that way by focusing on weaknesses. They figured out what they were good at, and they spent time honing that and turning it into a true strength. So, if we want to think about how we fix our schools, this is a path model that our researchers and scientists at Gallup have validated through various studies. But it's essentially the economics of human development, right? That if you focus on your strengths, figure out what they are, and put them to work every day, that drives both hope and engagement. These are separate constructs, but they usually move together. If a student has high hope, they're usually a student with high engagement and vice versa. That in turn drives what Gallup calls well-being, and we'll come back to that because we've actually defined that in our research. And it also drives standard classic measures of student success, like degree completion, grades, etc., right? So in our path of driving these human economic drivers, we're also improving some of the classic metrics that we are perseverating over today. It turns out that hope, engagement, and well-being, these three constructs together, account for as much as a third of the variance of student success. We're not measuring this stuff today. Our schools aren't measuring this, right? But it accounts for a third of the variance of student success. So going back to our global research, Gallup launched the World Poll about 6 years ago, and through the World Poll, we're now statistically sampling 98% of the world's population, which is really just kind of mind-blowing every time I think about it. So if you kind of want to know what the whole world is thinking, that's data that Gallup has been trying to collect and gather. And we've studied that around a couple major domains, well-being research and also engagement. And I'm going to talk about these things in a couple of buckets. So what we found about well-being, we went out and we asked everybody in the world 2 key questions. We asked them to rate their life on a scale of 1 to 10, right? 10 being the best possible life, 1 being the worst imaginable. And then we asked them the next question, where do you think it'll be in 5 years? And those are the 2 anchoring questions for all of our well-being research. So what we've done is we've found which items or behaviors are predictive of people rating their lives highly. So in our research, we found 5 key domains: career, essentially what you do with your time and whether you like it. By the way, this could be for retired people or students. So you can define career well-being in the same way that you could somebody in a job. Social, which is the relationships in your life. Community, which would be essentially your involvement in the area you live. Financial, this is the interesting one, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but it's essentially not how much money you make, but it's how you manage your finances, which would be something very powerful to teach young people about today, because there were a couple comments earlier about, I just want to make more money. That's the number one goal, I want to make more money. Their well-being is probably going to suffer if that's their only drive that they have in terms of school performance. And then physical is essentially what it sounds like, which is your basic health and wellness. So here's what's interesting. Well-being matters to the world. Gallup got a lot of attention when folks started to realize that our well-being measures were much more predictive of unrest in a country than classic measures like GDP. So if you looked at Tunisia or Egypt in the years leading up to Arab Spring, you saw GDP in both countries going up steadily. So if you were just looking at GDP, you'd say, man, things are going pretty well in this country. But our measures of well-being during that same time frame were plummeting in both countries. And what did it lead to? Massive social unrest. So all of a sudden, this soft measure of well-being, right? If I start a conversation and say, hey, we measure well-being, people are like, oh, that's neat. How nice, right? And they kind of give you a pat on the back and like out the door kind of thing. Well, I tell you what, well-being is real. It's here to stay, thanks to a lot of this research. Now, look at how it matters to organizations. So these are costs, healthcare costs to employers for individuals who are either thriving in all 5 domains of well-being or none at all. And you can look at this. This is literally a stepwise function. I'm not thriving in any domains. I cost my company an average of $9,300. I'm thriving in 1 domain, 2, 3, 4, 5. It goes all the way down to $3,500. Think of the difference in where we'd be with healthcare costs today if we focused on employees and how they were thriving across these domains of well-being. It's a game changer. I mean, literally, people are arguing that our healthcare tab is going to bankrupt our country right now. We have to fix this stuff. And fixing it, by the way, starts in our schools, because this well-being process is both a means and an end, right? So now I want to talk about what our most important finding was on the world poll, and that was this. No matter what country we asked it, everybody in the world wants the same thing. They want a good job. Now, this took a backseat to things like health and happiness and all kinds of other things that are typically at the top of the list. Everybody still wants those other things, by the way, but they see them as being achieved through a good job. So we've got the whole world, every country, wanting a good job. This is backed up by data here in the United States about what Americans think of as the purpose for going to college, right? Number one being to earn more money, number two, to get a good job. So this is what's on the minds of parents, this is what's on the minds of students: earn more money, get a good job. But what's interesting is we don't really know what a good job looks like. And I'm going to talk about what a good job looks like from two perspectives: what we know about career well-being and what we know about engagement at work and in the school. So career well-being would look at somebody who does things like interesting and meaningful activities, right? It would be they're using their strengths every day, they're achieving some goals in their job. A couple of the fundamental items that are on our surveys that really just nail it in terms of measuring career well-being, it's how you can answer these two questions on a 5-point scale, right? 5 being strongly agree. I like what I do each day. Think about that one. Think about how many of you can say yes to that question, a strong 5 to that question. And I do what I'm best at every day. Not once a week, not once a month, every day. Those are really strong items. But if you can say 5 to both of those questions, you're someone who very likely has very high career well-being. So when we look at this from what a good job looks like, it's very related. These are our famous, what we call Q12 items, which folks like Scott Johnson and Wells Fargo are using in their measurements of employee engagement, which he mentioned earlier. These are the 12 items that Gallup found are predictive of key performance outputs in businesses, including revenue, profit, you name it. And there are questions like doing what I do best every day. I have someone, check out this word care comes back in here. My supervisor or someone at work cares. So this is a consistent thing. This is true in schools, among teachers. This is true in the workplace. To have someone who cares about my development, that's a really critical question. So as you look at these things, these are definitions of a good job. It's not just any job. It's not how much money you make. It's literally whether or not you're engaged from the perspective of you're doing what you like to do, you're doing what you're best at, you have someone who cares about your development. Unfortunately, our numbers in the workplace might actually look even worse than they do in schools, because only about 28% of the US workforce is what we would categorize as engaged based on this data. We have the vast majority of us just showing up and kind of checking in, right? Clock in, clock out. They're not doing a bad job necessarily, but they're not super engaged. And then we've got almost 20% of our workforce, this is always funny, that our researchers call them actively disengaged. So I was always like, what does that mean? What it means is you're so disengaged that you're actually actively spreading all of that, vicious ill will about the company and your unhappiness with other people. So you're at lunch and you're like, man, this place is horrible. And right? I mean, that's actively disengaged. So they're the ones who, if the building burned down today, they'd be like, awesome. So we got a long way to go. Now, I'm not going to bore you with these slides. I just want to tell you, they tell you two things, right? This is a path model that shows that one of the leading predictors of student performance on standardized tests in both math and in reading is teacher engagement. Okay, so if you just wanted to say, if you ask Gallup, what's the number one thing we could do to improve student engagement in the state of Iowa? It is exactly what the governor is talking about and what I would call a teacher talent pipeline that you've described, where you're looking to find the best teachers, train the best teachers, incentivize the best teachers, right? So this is the model of how you improve student engagement. We think of student engagement as things we do to the student, for the student, through the student, around the student, but we forget that the number one driver of this is just simply an engaged teacher. So if we go back to this model and we think about teacher engagement as one of those primary drivers of student engagement, I'm just going to give you a real simple model to look at here. It's what we call the school engagement model. The number one predictor of engaged teachers is a great leader in that building, a principal. If you have a great principal, they build an engaged workplace. That engaged workplace is teachers. Those engaged teachers drive student engagement. So if you just want to make this really simple, that's what it is. And instead of aiming for grades and graduation, right, to think about a different target, a further longer-term target of aiming for things like career well-being, for example, or life well-being, if we dare to go that far. But what's interesting about this is everybody says, well, you can't measure that. How do you measure that? We can measure this stuff. It's not easy, but we can measure it. We can quantify what hope looks like. Hope is one's ideas and energy for the future. There are questions that get at what hope is all about, and guess what? The good news is hope is a very malleable construct. If you have a student with low hope, there are things you can do as parents, as teachers, as mentors, coaches, to increase their hope. And that is really very positive, refreshing perspective. So if I boil this down to what we ought to create as a new Bill of Rights for students, it's this simple. A student should come into school every day and be able to say yes to these three things. I have someone who cares about my development always. I either do or develop what I like to do, and I either do or develop what I'm best at. That's real simple. Now, I'm not suggesting we throw out standardized testing. I'm not suggesting we get rid of all the metrics we use to track today. But standardized tests and grades are intermediate outcomes on the way to the more important ultimate outcomes of career and life well-being. And we can and have measured this. In fact, we've measured across the entire world. We've got consistent items in 160 countries across all kinds of different languages. So in terms of where we go and thinking about a new report card, and I'll just end on this, our suggestion would be that we think about this as a portfolio, where about a third of how we evaluate teachers and students in schools would be based on the measures we use now, standardized testing, grades, et cetera. About a third would be these behavioral economics that we've shared today around things like hope and engagement and well-being. And another third would be something that we've all talked about today in various ways, competency-based learning, experiential learning, et cetera, but to actually create as many opportunities as possible for students to be engaged in real-world period or real-world exercises. So let me leave you on that. Thank you very, very much for being here today, and thank you to the partnership for convening this forum. Appreciate it.
To watch this or any program from the Intelligent Talk television series, go to iptv.org.
Funding for this program was provided by Friends of Iowa Public Television, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, and generations of families and friends who feel passionate about Iowa Public Television programs.